I was kind of worn out. I did not. I just put it here on the side, just for you.
It's fine, only 5 minutes, and then it's about 1 minute. I'm sure you have jet lagging coming from Canada, right? Directly, right?
It's incredible.
I would imagine,
yeah. I didn't eat today. I didn't eat yesterday. I just don't. I slept for 12 hours.
No, it won't.
I woke up so mixed up.
Right.
Where am I?
I'm sure the light is not helping either. But they've been light all the time.
They convinced me to go drinking last night until midnight and drank quite a bit.
No,
So that doesn't help either.
No,
I guess I was
it
stupid
doesn't.
to myself. You don't drink at bed, huh?
No, I actually do.
I don't.
Yeah.
No, I know limits. I'm worried about the job.
No, I mean, I heard that a few people went drinking last night, but I was just completely worn out. I couldn't do it anymore. Went to bed at 11 maybe. Yeah.
Did you go for any of the sessions this morning?
Yeah, I was here for the opening talk, which was quite interesting. Yeah, that was really nice, actually. The opening plenary was okay-ish, not that exciting. That was fun. And then the couple of sessions I went to afterwards were really nice. Both had Curtis Bernard on them. And,
Curtis, right?
Yeah. And they were really good. One of them was about evolution, denialism, and anti-science movements.
Is that coming?
And the other one was about the mentality of
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. We are opening now the first afternoon plenary of the conference, and we are going directly to the focus of the theme of the conference, asking critical questions, doing critical questioning in the public sphere, and modeling, remodeling, restructuring, opening, but not closing the role of science journalists. The moderator will be Pallab Ghosh, BBC, past president of the World Federation of Science Journalists. Please, Pallab, the floor is yours and your speakers.
Vesa, thank you very much indeed. This plenary, as Vesa explained, is organised by the World Federation of Science Journalists, an association of 40 or so national science journalism associations, and growing all the time, and commissioner of this entire conference. Now, the idea of this session, I mean, I'm sure you've been to sessions where the main part goes on.
Do you hear, Pallab? Okay, take it a little bit closer to your mouth.
Fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like
Is this better? Thanks, Vesa. So we've all been to these sessions, which are great, but the main part goes on a bit too long, and it really gets going when the questioning and comments start. Well, the whole point is that the questioning and the comment are going to be the main part. This is an opportunity for the community of science journalists and those that are interested in science journalism to have a conversation among ourselves, to share our experiences. And so the star of this plenary is the audience. And I hope you'll, as we're talking, think up some comments and questions to share. Oh, I should also add that this is not just a talking shop, because the World Federation has begun a process in partnership with the Kavli Foundation to have a high-level symposium in February, so that we come along to these meetings and bemoan the state of science journalism, and we sort of feel a bit better, but nothing ever happens. We want someone to sort it all out for us. You know, somehow publishers have got to start making profits and employ us again. So this process is about us taking responsibility and coming up with a path, a policy document that will enable the World Federation and our national associations to start doing the things that need to be done in order to make things better, to address some of these concerns of ours. And some of these things could be to grow our national associations, to make them stronger, to make them professional bodies with full-time staff or more full-time staff, so they advocate for science journalists in the same way that any other trade body does. They advocate to publishers, they advocate to politicians. And perhaps we could have sponsored science journalists. I don't know what the answers are, but the point of this session is for you to help us. And so your comments won't just be lost and just part of what people said at a conference. They really will be fed. This is the start of that process. And this is your opportunity to help shape the future of science journalism. Now, the way we're going to tackle this is we've got two experienced journalists and two up-and-coming journalists. We're just going to lay a few thoughts, a few seeds for the conversation ahead. And the theme of the opening remarks is how critical, kick-ass science journalism is necessary and can be helpful, and why it should be preserved. We'll begin with Pallava Bagla, who's the science editor of New Delhi Television and also contributor to Science magazine. Pallava, would you care to say a few words about the issue of critical science reporting and perhaps some examples from your own coverage?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Pallava. Can you hear me?
No.
No?
Yes.
We can.
No.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. Technology. We are in a science journalist meeting. It's a pleasure to be here, and I have grown with the World Federation of Science Journalists. So sitting here in front of an August gathering like this is not easy. I am a person on television. I normally deal with just one camera and not so many hundreds of two eyes. It's tough. So if I am able to convey what I am, I would be thankful to you. Pallav asked about what he calls kick-ass journalism. I practice journalism the way I have learned it, and critical questioning comes to me very naturally. I do understand that the world is diverse. I come from India, which is the world's largest democracy. Asking questions, hitting out at the government, and getting away with it is all very natural for me. So if there are others who feel different from me, I respect them, and I understand there are boundaries and limits. I'll start with a story which is extremely relevant today. People who have been following what is happening in India, there's a very large unfolding humanitarian disaster in the Himalayas today. More than 1,000 people died. There was a large cloudburst about a week ago. And large parts of the Western Himalayas received over 40 centimeters of rain in 48 hours. They were cut off, and thousands of people have died. Many thousands have been stranded high in the hills. Again, the story goes back. The story which I wrote has linkages to this, what is happening today. In 2004, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the IPCC, 2,500 of the world's best scientists released a report on climate change, which was considered a landmark report. In that report, they had said that the glaciers in the Himalayas would melt by 2035, which is in the next 35 years. The third pole, as it is called, would melt, and there would be no ice there. I have walked in the Himalayas since I was a small kid. My mother took me there. That fact didn't quite gel with me. So in 2008, I wrote in the Science magazine and subsequently in the BBC and for the online and with New Delhi Television, which is my main television network. I wrote about the fact that there was something wrong in the assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on Himalayan glaciers. 2009, if you recall, was the year when the big conference in Copenhagen was happening. Everybody was writing about climate change, and everybody was talking that the climate is changing. And the Himalayan glacier example was an iconic example of what would happen to the world when the climate changes or the world warms up. At that time, to write a story saying that the IPCC got one of its facts wrong, and we wrote that saying that they got the facts wrong because they did not use the right kind of literature from which the facts needed to arise. They are mandated to use peer-reviewed articles and literature, but the IPCC had erred in using gray literature, which is an ordinary journalistic piece of writing to come to this conclusion. When I wrote about it in November, the November issue of the Science magazine, it was not an easy task, even in the magazine, to write about it, because to go against the stream is not easy. So that is what I think Pallav calls critical questioning. We were questioning the very fact that this conclusion was probably incorrect. And I'm saying probably incorrect because at that time, we were just leaving it out in the open that maybe they got it wrong. We mustered a lot of scientific opinion on that. It exploded in the kind of what is called the Himalayan gate for the IPCC. It got linked also with the whole issue of the emails which were leaked at that point. At the magazine and the television station, we kept our eyes on the ball. We did not lose focus that we were talking about a wrong scientific fact being put out by such an august body. Ultimately, when the British papers took it on in a very big way, it propelled into a huge global controversy. And within a few weeks, the IPCC accepted, which till date remains their only regret they have offered, which is that, yes, we got our facts wrong on that. But I must acknowledge that while I wrote the story, I wouldn't have been able to do what I did without supportive editors. The most heavy lifting on that story was done by my international editor, Richard Stone. And I can acknowledge here the role of the Federation as well. I have never said that earlier. But I knew behind me there is a body of people who will stand behind me if something goes wrong. And believe me, the pressure was intense. Very intense pressure came on me and my editors to say initially that we were wrong. But we didn't err from the middle path. We continued with it. And the correction happened. And that is the beauty of science, which is what keeps me in science journalism. More recently, I wrote about an American geophysicist. Some of you may know an earthquake specialist, Roger Billum, who was kicked out of India for writing stuff that some parts of India were very vulnerable to earthquakes, which it is. But he said India is siting many of the nuclear plants in areas which are very vulnerable. It was one of the most difficult stories for me to crack. I wrote this in November of 2012. The magazine closes on a Tuesday. On Tuesday night, I told my wife, I have written this story. I do not know on Friday when the magazine hits the stands, whether on Monday I will lose access to the Indian government. It was a story which was hitting at the heart of the Indian establishment, saying that they kicked out a nuclear geophysicist who was questioning the Indian nuclear establishment. The opposite happened. I got even more access into the Indian establishment. So there are flip sides to it. The last point I would make is, in practicing what I do, there are challenges. I have faced a lawsuit from Monsanto when we were writing about our stuff on genetically modified foods being introduced in India, genetically modified plants. And believe me, to survive a lawsuit from Monsanto and still be around wearing my own pants is not easy. At that point, I was deserted by my editors. I was left alone. In the Himalayan glaciers, my editors stood by me. It was not the Science magazine, I should say, but my editors deserted me. I had to fight that on my own, and I did. For people who want to practice critical science journalism, one small piece, these are high-hanging fruits. Plucking them is not easy. Sometimes it takes weeks or months to crack a story. You have to be tenacious. It doesn't give you money, but it's fun. That much I can say.
Pallava, thank you very much. And I think that's one of the issues that we face. Not only are we losing our jobs, we're in danger of losing our values, because with fewer people having to do more, there's less time for people to do the kind of things that Pallava are doing. With publishers not making as much money, they can't stand up to lawsuits. So well done, Pallava, for setting an example. I also think it's an example of how you do something that really pisses off the scientific establishment. You know, you wouldn't get science communicators doing that. Science communication is important, but only critical science journalism could have revealed something about the IPCC that was in the public good. They've become better as a result. So our next speaker is Veronique Morin from Canada, who'll be talking about the muzzling of scientists by the Canadian government. Vero.
Thank you. I'll just say a few words about what I do before moving on to the muzzling issue. So I'm an independent science journalist based in Canada. I'm working for a science magazine television program on Télé-Québec, which is a public broadcaster. And I'm also writing print magazines, and currently I'm developing a documentary series on Indigenous people and their relationship to science and medicine. So my previous documentary, Time Bombs, which I researched and was credited for original idea, was a accumulation of 4 years of investigative work. Time Bombs is about the top secret mission of Canadian soldiers training in the Nevada under the atomic bomb in the 50s and 60s. The documentary aired in 2009 and won several awards, but most importantly, the very few soldiers that were still alive today finally got recognition from the Canadian government and acknowledgement from the authorities that this series of training mission actually took place and were performed for the benefit of scientific research and with the knowledge that it was detrimental to their health. They received finally a small monetary compensation. So it's expected from us when we engage as science journalists in investigative work to have to dig hard and to find the facts and to have to dig deeper than normally. It's expected also that governments will withhold information because of national security reasons, and you know. What is not expected, and this is the current situation that we are in Canada right now, is that government in a democratic society will use the excuse of national security to pursue an ideological agenda that will benefit only a small group to the detriment of a larger group. So government, as you know, invests largely, increasingly in science and technology. Because they know that their intelligence and the economic wealth and capacity of a country is benefiting from science investment. Behind science research, There is an incredible, there is extraordinary strategic intelligence, either political or private, and now in the current environment, actually political and private are becoming intertwined. So it is the duty of science journalists to uncover those relevant stories to the public, those relevant public research. We do our job through curiosity. You heard it from Vesa yesterday, asking the right question, explaining as well as exposing, and also through investigative methods if we have to. And evidently we have to be driven by the burning passion to serve the public. Journalists have only one master, and it is the public. So a few years ago, about 10 years ago, I was extremely optimistic about the state of science journalism. Universities were investing in programs, newsrooms seemed to make place for science stories. They were actually hiring more science journalists. Science was making the headlines like it seemed to never have done before. There were some real investments, and the World Federation was offering some promising program. But since then, there's a new situation that has arisen first in the US and then in Canada, and now it seems somewhat in the UK, judging from recent headlines. For the past few years, we have been denied access to scientists that are producing public research for the Canadian government. The government, in an effort to control the message that they don't like, has decided to shut out scientists specifically working in the field of the environment, natural resources, fisheries and oceans, which are so important in a country like Canada. So our job has changed, and in this new environment of secrecy, and we have to step up. Last year, our two national science writers associations, the CSWA, Canadian Science Writers Association, and the Association des Communicateurs Scientifiques, ACS, have won, who are both, by the way, members of the World Federation of Science Journalists, have won an important International Freedom Award from the Canadian journalists for free expression because they denounced the Muslim issue in Canada. And as a result, the Canadian Information Commissioner has decided to launch an investigation into this serious and troubling problem we face. So this is the beginning of a great achievement, and it's promising that the Commissioner is looking into this. And it shows how science journalists can and have to work together for the benefit of better reporting and for the public, and to preserve freedom of speech and our democratic rights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Veronique. I think your comments reflect the fact that we can't take things at face value. A tradition in science journalism is to translate, to make things clear. But as we've heard in these two examples, it's also to question. A colleague of mine at the BBC who presents an evening news discussion programme, his name's Jeremy Paxman, once said that his approach to interviews is to think to himself while he's interviewing the person, why is this lying bastard lying to me? Now, I'm not suggesting that scientists always lie, but it is worth bearing in mind that you do need to test, you do need to question. People aren't always straightforward and honest. I often wanted to kind of have a motto for the World Federation of Science Journalists, which is in God we trust, everyone else we check out. But Vesta wouldn't let me. But anyway, to respond to what we've heard, first of all, Lucy Calderon from Guatemala.
This is a pleasure for me to be here. And for me, science journalism is about passion, about integrity, and the wish of doing a good job, because in every region of the world we face different problems. For example, I can speak about Central America, where I live, and unfortunately there we have a lot of issues we could cover. Unfortunately, the owners of the newspapers doesn't care. They don't care. For example, in 2009, during the COP15, for example, I won a scholarship to cover the conference. And I was allowed to go only because of that, because I won a scholarship. I mean that newspapers do not invest in sending you to cover such kind of events. Even though Guatemala City is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world because of climate change. So that is why I say this is about what you want to achieve and what do you want to leave for the next generations of journalists. So about my experience, it has been very hard to get the spaces in the newspaper to cover information related to science, but fortunately, by this time, at a private university, they are allowing me to give a short seminar about science journalism. And this is a seed that is flourishing because at least now we are 2 persons covering science journalism. And I think there is a lot of work to do. And that is why I'm so pleased to join the World Federation of Science Journalists, because they are doing a very good job. And I hope that we could make something for Latin America, specifically for Central America. So that's what I can tell you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And also to respond is Mohamed Yahia, who's the editor of Nature Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you, Pella. Yeah, I think the mic is working, and probably my voice can be loud enough. You don't need it. So 2 years ago, I was on a plenary in the same conference in Doha, and I was arguing that post the Arab revolutions and the Arab Spring, there was a very strong need for critical, deep, and investigative science journalism to address the myriad of problems that we were and will be facing, and that we couldn't afford anything less than that. 2 years forward, and that I cannot say that has happened exactly, and it shows, and it's having a very serious effect on the problems that we're facing right now in my part of the world. So, listening to the stories we just heard, it's incredible what science journalists could be doing and how they could be exerting an effort to have better science-informed policy taking place, which is exactly what we're lacking right now. Because huge decisions, governments are taking huge decisions that are not science involved, and which down the line will have, I think, will have some very negative effects. And just a couple of really quick examples from Egypt, where I come from, that I would give. The first of them is about the position or the location of our first nuclear power station, which has been in the media for quite a long time, and you've had people pro this particular locations and others who are protesting against having that power station in this particular place. And during that discussion, it became completely politicized, and you have all kinds of journalists jumping into that, but science journalists have been sidestepped out of the picture. So we don't really have any science research that can actually tell us if this is a good location or if it will have the problems that the people protesting against it say it will have. And the problem is that science journalists let this happen. I mean, they allowed themselves to be sidestepped rather than forcing themselves in with this kind of critical approach to journalism and taking a different step and asking people to step back and look at a wider picture. Another example, which is much more recent and has been all over the news, has been Ethiopia's plans to build the Renaissance Dam, which is an incredibly politicized issue back home, and it's got to the degree where where you have politicians threatening water wars, and this is, I think, the most serious water war threat that I have endured during my lifetime. So you've got those people arguing about the dam and whether it will affect Egypt's water supply and the kind of negative effects it will have, and Ethiopia is saying it will not have those effects. But nobody has been exploring the science deep enough. There has not been a critical look at the science, the quality of the science that the decisions have been based on. And we actually recently did a story about that for Nature Middle East, where we stepped back and we were asking what science are you basing those decisions on, and what's the quality of that science? How good is it? How reliable is it? Is it something that we should be, is it peer reviewed? Is it something that we should be basing our decisions on or not? And it was really interesting because once you started talking to the scientists who were completely voiceless in the whole discussion, they were incredibly terrified that there might be a war and they were not being heard, and they were arguing that all they need is just some more time to actually present good science that would actually inform whether the dam as it is planned to be built right now is the best option or if they should change the design. And that extends to everything. We have a completely messed up education system that is in need of serious overhaul, but this is the decision to do that is not being taken with any science reference. For example, we have the Finnish education system, which is a very good example, but no one has looked at that because there has not been any research on how you can apply that system to a place like Egypt. So I don't want to extend much longer because I know that journalists get really fidgety when they're in an audience and someone's talking too much. I've been there, but this is just to give you an example of that need that we have for critical science journalism, and that if we don't, as science journalists, do that job, then I think the effects will be much bigger than just losing our jobs, which is happening, because it will have very dire effects on our countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, and I think you ended on a point that we can start, in that there has to be a real advocacy for what we do. We can come across as real pains in the arses, but it does serve a public good when we do report things that are sometimes uncomfortable or doesn't seem very helpful in the short term. Now we're moving to a state we'd normally call questions, but what I'd like us to do is to have a conversation. We're not experts, there are kind of good journalists here. So I'd just like to kind of hear your comments, your thoughts, your stories, and if you want to, ask some questions. And as I say, this is part of a process, so if you've got any ideas, things that you think the World Federation ought to start enacting to deal with some of the issues facing our professions, notes are being taken. And also, when the microphone comes to you, could I please ask you to give your name and how you should be described? Who'd like to ask a question or make a comment?
Hi, I'm Catherine Scott, and I'm Canadian, but I just came from the lecture on science journalism in totalitarian states, and the overwhelming conclusion seemed to be that economic forces are more destructive to science journalism than totalitarian governments. So I'm wondering if there is some model of state-sponsored journalism that we could be all following or trying to advocate for. Is there a way to sell this to governments and to the public so that we're not totally affected by these economic forces? And from what you said, I think Veronique, was that the government is preventing science journalists from asking the right questions anyways, whether they're funding the research or not. So I guess with all of that, what would you think about that?
So someone who might have something to offer on it is Professor Jean-Marc Fleury, who's a professor of science journalism. You've looked at some of these alternative models. I assure you people who aren't Canadian will also be allowed to speak as well, but Jean-Marc, would you just like to respond?
Well, if there is someone from Switzerland in the room, Switzerland has been Olivier. Olivier, you could explain what you're doing that directly addresses the issue raised by Canadian.
What are you thinking about?
That there is a kind of, for me it's difficult words, but state-sponsored, I don't know, supported, there is a support from the Switzerland government for science journalism, and it has been a success from what I've been told.
Okay, I see now what you mean. So my name is Olivier Desibor. I'm the president of the Swiss Association for Science Journalism. And you're right that we have some examples of journalists. For example, the science journalist working for the Swiss agency that is supported through not one financial support, but through all the universities in Switzerland that are putting money in the same pot and financing the same, just one science job at the Swiss news agency. So some may critique that because it's a lady, she would have maybe some pressure from the universities to write more stories about their university, which is not the case because she writes totally independently from any pressure, and this has been assured by his board at the Swiss news agency. What we would like to do now with the Swiss Association is something similar, in a way that we would like to promote young journalists or people wanting to do science journalism to be able to follow some journalism school in Switzerland, and with the association we would collect the money, and through the association allow some young people to follow those journalism schools. So this is a model we are trying now to develop. It's not developed yet, but we are working on this, and I hope it's going to work out.
Thank you, Olivier. I do think we do need to start thinking the unthinkable, alternative models of supporting quality journalism. I mean, at the moment it just seems anathema to have a science writer in residence of a big national newspaper because, somehow their independence is compromised. But better there's a science writer, science journalist in residence than no science journalist at all. So some more stories, comments, ideas. Who's next?
Dominique Leglu from France. I just wanted to say hello to my Canadian counterpart and say you're very lucky. Apparently your documentary was able to be broadcasted about these nuclear soldiers who were in Nevada. I can tell you that to promote a documentary on nuclear things in France is still very, very difficult. You don't find the money to do it. The producers don't want to take the risk,
it's tough.
and the channels do not want either. Mm-hmm. So when I hear about a state-sponsored organization, okay, for some subjects, maybe, but certainly not for subjects which relate directly to sovereignty. Well, we need real power in our journalistic organizations. That's where we can fight. Otherwise, it's you can't win.
Well, you can't sell out. It took me 4 years, as I said, to bring this documentary to life, and I met 5 different producers, and the answers were there's not enough money, it's not enough entertaining, it's too serious. And so it took a 5th one. It's actually a very small production company that took it on, some friends of mine, and so it went as far as to kick ass the government. That's what it did, and it happened to arrive at the timing where the government just came into power and they didn't know what to do with this. So they struggled. They hid some information. the main historian of the Defense Department was trying to hide the documents. He responded that these documents proving that Canadian soldiers were sent in the Nevada were so not important. It was like keeping bills on buying pencils, and we have him on camera saying that to us. So anyway, so it was a long struggle, and I'm having the same issue with the other documentary series that I'm trying to. So that's why I have also other freelance gigs. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to eat. But I'm saying I understand what you're saying, that there are some. It's harder, but you can't in some countries. But you can't. I think you can't sell out. I get that all the time. You should sell out. Never. But the title of my presentation was stepping up. By stepping up, you have to do investigative work, but paradoxically, you have to lay low also. You have to be used to lay low and sometimes use a different strategy to get your information.
It's horrifying hearing these stories from Canada. You kind of think China, Iran, but Canada makes you think. And I'd just say that state-sponsored journalism can work. As someone from the BBC, I'd recommend that model, so perhaps you could persuade the Harper government to introduce a licence fee and a national broadcaster. But anyway, some more comments.
I'm Ulla Järvi from Finland. The one thing I would like to stay aboard is when I was in somebody else, quite many else, in workshop where we were discussing about scientific fraud. And there were journalists from Sweden, Britain and Denmark. And they told about the journalists who had exposed scientific frauds in their countries. And they were all news journalists or other investigative, the ordinary journalists. No one of them was a real science journalist like we are here. Is this the scientific frauds two big issues for us? Brian Dare, a British awarded investigative journalist, said that we are too socialized with scientific communities and we are too close off, and 80 or 90% of science journalism is only a PR journalism. What do you think about that?
I think it's hard for journalists when they've got to do so much. They've got to make a living. So a lot of journalists have got to do PR because it pays more, and maybe they might find some time to do some. Yes. Thank you. And give your name.
Nalaka Gunawardana from Sri Lanka. Just a question for the whole panel, really. Critical questioning in the public sphere is not easy in the best of times and the best of societies, the most open societies. But what about societies that are under siege, where the public sphere is in fact under siege from fundamentalists, from ultranationalists, and the rise of too many sacred cows in some of our societies, which makes the practice of science journalism hazardous, to put it mildly. How do we cope with Taliban questioning the efficacy of vaccines, or others raising doubts about established science in various areas and spheres, which have clear public safety, public health implications, and politicians are running for safety and cover? In such situations, how do we speak up for science?
I will hand over to the panel, but have you had experience of that yourself?
I have. Yeah, for example, this phenomenon that I call saffronization of science in my own country, where the rise of militant Buddhism and co-opting certain credentialed established scientists into supporting some very unscientific theories and claims. And taking that on has brought me under a lot of pressure and vilification. For example, the nexus between agrochemicals and mass kidney failure. And when all sorts of claims and hypotheses were being made, some of us asked for evidence, scientific evidence in peer-reviewed circles, and that was not forthcoming. We were asked to believe rather than accept uncritically. So these are the issues that are confronting us every day.
Sorry to kind of put focus on it. It's an interesting story. But how did you deal with it? What could be done to help people like yourself?
Well, we could do with a lot more solidarity in terms of science writing circles, but also what stuns me is the silence of many scientists who'd rather not speak up when ultranationalists and fundamentalists are setting the public agenda. So we need more scientists to speak out with the courage of their conviction, not just in their own peer circles, but in the public sphere.
I think you've answered your question very well. But does anyone on the panel have any observations? Palava.
Nalaka, good question, but I don't think it really matters whether the country is in siege or whether the right wing or the left wing is in power. If the Taliban is questioning vaccines, the Americans used health workers to try and get the DNA of Osama bin Laden. That has jeopardized a lot of health workers across the world. That the polio eradication is in trouble because of that use. Was that justified? Was that correct? I'm not sure that was correct. But at the same time, you can't justify. In my personal opinion, the questions and the capacity to ask critical questions comes internally from the journalist. In 25 years of practicing journalism, I have never found, and I have great respect for Veronique and the others in the audience who've had issues. I have never found an editor who will pass on a good story. You come with solid evidence, a solid proposal. The editor will never pass on a good story if he's a good editor. If he's a good editor, he is there to listen to you and do a good story. I told you, it's not, if you're in it for making money, then you are in the wrong job. But I work in a place where asking questions is accepted.
But with respect, Palava, editors are saying no to great stories all the time, particularly in the United Kingdom with the ferocious libel laws that we have. The BBC is an organisation that's got the funds to take on court cases, but there are small magazines that have got stories they know to be true that are in the public interest, but quite simply, editors can't publish them because they're fearful of the libel laws. I'd just like to turn to Alok Jha of The Guardian.
Yeah, I'm Alok Jha from The Guardian. Thanks very much. I've got a comment to make and a question as well for the panel and actually for the room. One, thanks very much for your stories and everyone else as well. I mean, this is exactly why I want to come to conferences like this. It's to hear these sorts of things, to understand how to be a better journalist, actually. And I wish there were more sessions like this where we can just work out for a whole hour how you did what you did in those individual stories, because I'd like to learn those things. So whoever does the next conference, please bear that in mind as a personal request. I think that they're useful things because sometimes we don't get trained in these ways, and I think it's good to share, to build that solidarity, to build those international networks that sometimes we might need your help and we can all work together internationally on those sorts of things. So that's one comment. On the question of critical journalism versus what I suppose we can call explanatory journalism, which is an issue we talked about at the UK Science Journalism Conference this time last year. There's a session on explanatory journalism, the idea that there's still a role and a value in explaining complex things, which I do believe there is. I want to know what the panel in this room thinks of moves by people like the Wellcome Trust to launch its own magazine, which is going to be independent journalism, as they call it, where they will pay science journalists lots of money and give them lots of time to report deeply about complex issues that they fund or areas of research that they're interested in. The Wellcome Trust is, by all accounts, a wonderful, benevolent organisation, but I wonder what people feel about that as journalism, as a model for journalism, as a model for paying for the kind of deep investigations that we'd like to do. Do you think that's the kind of thing that we're going to have to suck up and see? Because I find it slightly troubling that anyone who's not a journalist should be running those sorts of things. And the state-sponsored thing came up earlier. The BBC is a case in point. It's state-sponsored to an extent, but it's still under political pressure often. As amazing as it is, I mean, it's the greatest journalistic organisation in the world, probably, but it still comes under immense pressure and the whims of politicians. So, we need to be independent. So how do we do that? And how do we do it in the face of these different funding models that come along?
I'd suggest, Alok, that The Guardian's the greatest journalistic organisation in the world. But if I may offer an answer to your question, I'd find it difficult if I'd accepted money from the Wellcome Trust as a journalist, if I then found out that the Wellcome Trust had done something bad, and if I wanted to get another commission from the Wellcome Trust. So I see that as a problem. Does anyone else have a view on what Alok said specifically rather than their own comment? Could you go to the gentleman there?
Regarding what Alok said, there is in terms of independence of journalism, by the way, I forgot, my name is Dino Trescher from Germany. There is something called The Third Way, and it's a paper by Stefan Weichert, The Third Way, Why We Need Journalism Financed by Foundations. And I recommend this to be a solid paper on how the future of journalism can be evolved. And this is with regard to what Alok just said. The independence of journalism needs a third way.
And as I said at the beginning, we perhaps need to start thinking some of these unthinkable things, because it's better to have critical or good quality science journalism than nothing at all. The gentleman at the back.
Hi, this is kind of an answer to Alex's thing and a comment on other comments. My name is David Ropeek. I used to be a television journalist in Boston. I do some other things now, but this is a story from then and about the topic at the moment. So I was contacted by a bunch of very reputable epidemiologists who said they had evidence that the nuclear power plant just south of Boston was contributing to elevated leukemia rates in the communities around that. No problem selling that to my bosses. Might be in France, where the government is very supportive of nuclear power, which is probably a unique problem for the atomic veterans in France, that story. In any event, what I'm getting to is this. I didn't have training in epidemiology, but I had covered nuclear power a lot and knew a reasonable amount about it, knew that nothing like this had been established, studied for a long time the data they had, went to the Harvard School of Public Health to learn about it, reported on it, huge splash, huge economic pressure from the utility company that owned the plant against my bosses. They threatened to pull their advertising from the station if I continued to report it. My bosses allowed me to continue to report it. Here's the end of the story. The environmental scientists who trained me on this data and brought me the story were anti-nuclear. And looking back on and in talking with other scientists, later we talk about we have to get scientists to inform us. They have agendas, that's the question. Other scientists said, you were taken, son. And I look back on that with shame, because I was. So there's a story for you, Alec. And I don't know how to handle that, but it's a cautionary tale, I think, about us talking about finding the right scientists and being science journalists. We're not expert in everything. How do you... It's a story for us to consider.
We're not experts in any particular thing, but we can become experts in journalism. And I think that we have a process and if we have an integrity, we can contribute a great deal.
I commend that answer, and I was an award-winning journalist for being thorough and thoughtful, but some of the stuff was just beyond me. And it was also persuasive to my personal politic, and that's hard to cut out, as objective as we all say we're supposed to be. It's an interesting question about scientific complexity challenging a science journalist who is an expert in all things and is trying to do the right thing. It's a story that I thought, we were talking about nuclear things earlier, that might be worth discussion.
Well, thank you for your story, and Alok, thank you for your comment. And as I say, I've been neglecting the panel because this is intended to be a little bit different. It's about you being the star. Could you get the microphone to Nick Phillips over there?
Thanks. Hi, I'm Nick Perkins from SciDevNet, and I had a question for Palava. There was a very intriguing detail in your story, and I wondered if it might be instructive, again, reflecting on ideas about how we can deal with these kind of situations. And you said you expected, when the story came out over the weekend, you expected on Monday morning to be shut out of the Indian government. But you said, in fact, exactly the opposite happened. And I wondered if you could just reflect a bit on why that happened, or why you think that happened, and whether or not there might be any transference around that.
Good question. I brought that up, and I was hoping somebody would pick it up, and I'm so happy you did. As journalists, sometimes we live under certain notions that we write something and that might be the repercussion. When I wrote that story that Roger Bilhem, the earthquake scientist from the University of Colorado, was turned back from the Delhi airport and sent packing on an aeroplane back to the US, the impression was he was sent back because he was writing against the nuclear plant. I faced several times I was researching that story. From within the very high echelons in the government, I was told, drop it. Don't write about it. We pursued with. It turned out at the end that Roger Bilhem was doing his work in India on a tourist visa. He was kicked out. He didn't have a right visa. He was making a lot of noise in America about being kicked out, while not telling people that for 20 years, he worked in India on a tourist visa where he needed a research visa. I travel to countries, and these days I don't report unless I have a journalist visa. I go to the US, every time I go there, I go on an I visa, international journalist visa. I come to Europe, I travel on the right visa. I make it sure. So a researcher of high repute, I have no idea. I felt the door will shut on me. But within 2 months, India conducted one of the most important tests of its missiles, which was to use a missile from a submarine to launch a nuclear weapon. They've been developing it for 15 years and there was no word about it. Lo and behold, in the March of 2013, I was told you can go and witness and report that. Why it happened, I have no idea. But I brought that point up to say, sometimes we build our own cocoons and feel that things will be shut on us and it's very difficult, it's very tough. No, it's not. You've chased the right questions, you get the facts right, and believe me, you have to be in a democracy for that to happen and people to listen to you. Have supportive editors, have a community like you who can be relied upon if you get into trouble. I can't ask for more.
I think it is about community. I mean, foreign correspondents are very good at caring more about what their colleagues and peers think about their stories than their news desks. And I think that's the culture we need to have. We need to have a pride. Just because the news editor didn't think it was a good story, if I know that my friend Palava thinks, or Veronique thinks it's a good story, then that's a good day's work for me. And I think we should think about that. Jens.
Thank you, Palab. No, I'll tell about a tremendous success story from Denmark. That about 10 years ago, the government passed a law which gave obligations to the universities to communicate science, and they also gave some obligations to the ministry to support it. And in a way, it has been very successful because there are more science stories in the media than ever. The problem is, at the same time as the universities have beefed up their communication units, the number of journalists have gone down. So the newspapers have sacked basically almost all their science journalists. So the stories you read in the media now, they are, every week you have cancer cured by some institute. And all the stories have some kind of only one source, only one institute, only those who have done. There's no perspective in it. And I think that's, of course, a problem on the long run. Because if you don't understand the whole picture, you lose credibility on the long run. And I also think that this one-sided positive journalism is of course good. You inform people, but on the other hand, if you have no critical journalism or no real journalism left, you have a real problem. So we will organize a conference on this next year in March, and if you have a good bit on how you reinstate science journalism, we would like to hear from you, because we may invite you to give a talk there.
It's a nice plug that you got in there for your conference. I think that the answer to your question is there's no point in having science journalists if all we do is what could go on the Wellcome Trust website or the NASA website or the CERN website. But the reason it's happening as well, you know, is that journalists are being asked to do 6 or 7 stories a day and just to kind of rewrite a press release, perhaps make one phone call, is all the time you've got to do that story. I know there are people that want to speak here, but I think, Ruth, you might want to speak directly to what Jens said.
Hi, yeah, Ruth Francis from Biomed Central. I was thinking about that and what Alok said about the Wellcome Trust setting up its own publication. And I think probably a lot of us in the room are aware of Matter, which was a Kickstarter project by an ex-Nature reporter Jim Giles and The Guardian's Bobby Johnson. I mean, the way that we consume news has changed. We're not tied to traditional newspapers. Academic journals are changing their business models and things are being published differently. I just wondered, there must be exciting experimental initiatives happening, and if not, why not? And what are we doing to try and, we should be trying to get ahead of the game, shouldn't we, rather than bemoaning the fact that things have changed, taking advantage of the fact that things have changed. So I'd love to hear about more initiatives and experiments.
One man who's always ahead of the game is Professor Fleury.
Thank you for what you said, because I think we should be looking forward. We should be taking the initiative, again, coming up with new ideas, experimenting. We should be trying, you know, making mistakes, errors, but going forward, not being shy of trying things. You know, journalism starts in all kinds of fashion. When I was young, the newspaper, my family was getting it ready. My father was getting by the mail. It was published by the Catholic Church, you know, and it was the best newspaper at that time. So there are all kinds of formulas that are being tried in the U.S. In the U.S.,
could you mention a few?
Okay, in the U.S. I think what we see there, and please, my friends from the US, you correct me, I think the individuals are becoming like their own brands. They're becoming recognized as, you know, so-and-so is a strong science journalist, and what happens is that the newspapers that probably sacked him or her now is buying stories from that same journalist and maybe giving much money again to that journalist. But that journalist now can contribute to other publications. So in Europe, it is different. In Europe, there is more experiments to collectively support science journalism compared in the US, where the experiments are more based on the individuals. I've been in Korea. In Korea, I've seen a science journalist who saw that the scientists, now they want to start blogs. They do blogs. And when we had the conference in London, if you remember, Nature, the key article on science journalism was that the future of science journalism maybe was blogs by scientists. Well, this Korean science journalist, he saw that the scientists want to produce blogs. So they work for him. He has created the website where the scientists publish their blogs. And he's keeping the good ones. He's instructing the bad ones on the mistakes they're doing. And he's creating a publication, using the scientists who want to communicate to eventually do good science journalism. And he's in charge. It's a science journalist who is in charge. So I think, Talab alluded to the fact that the World Federation is getting funding from Kavli Foundation. So this is what we have to find out. Creating opportunities, brainstorming, coming up with new ideas, and there are lots of people who want to support the good science journalism. And in the end, if the piece of journalism is written with the reader in mind, for the good of the readers, this is the main criteria. It is difficult to evaluate if a science journalist as a whole is good or bad. It is the piece of journalism in the end who decides.
No, thank you very much, Jean-Marc. And as you said, that is the purpose of this Kavli initiative, to brainstorm, to explore ideas. So if any of you've got some ideas, I think in the first instance, email me firstname.lastname@bbc.co.uk. Now, there are lots of hands going up now. There have been people waiting patiently at this side of the room, and I'll just do a quick run and try and get many in as possible.
I hope I'm not taking it back because we're following a certain line now. But just very quickly, and following on from what you were saying, Adele Beletta, from South Africa, a freelance journalist. Just following on from the last comment, it's just very interesting to note that the World Association of Newspapers conference recently in Bangkok, one of the things that, the key messages that came out of there, and I'm sure it's about the survival of traditional news and newspapers, is that editors are now saying, actually what we really need to be doing is to stimulate the best stories, because those things will always have currency. So I think that's a very important comment for journalism in general and for science journalism in particular. But I also just wanted to say that in terms of maybe from where I come from in that part of the world, I mean, one of the things that we have a problem with is that editors don't actually spend a lot of time worrying about investigative journalism because there is no time and there are no resources. And so that means that I think and I believe that freelancers, freelance journalists really have the open line for that. They can really go for it and try and sell their stories, although it is quite difficult and you won't earn money, as you say. So it's maybe back to living with your parents. So I think that that's an important point. And I just wanted to ask, if you don't mind, if I can go back. I'm really curious to know why Monsanto was suing you. Could you tell us?
I didn't follow what you asked.
Why were you being sued?
Oh. This is the Monsanto suit? Yep. Okay. See, in 1994, India imported 100 grams of PT cotton to be tested in India. And then subsequently, the trials went on for about 8 to 10 years. And anywhere in the world, wherever genetically modified foods have been tried, there is always a controversy. Those investigations were going on, which is the scientific investigations. I had gone and looked at the field trials which the Monsanto, along with its affiliates, were doing. And we found there was stuff lying around which shouldn't have been as part of the protocol. And I wrote about that. Obviously, Monsanto was not happy about it, and lo and behold, the moment we wrote the story, and there's a small practice I follow. The more controversial the story, the more I research it. And just before we publish the story, I send it back to my sources for fact-checking. It's not a practice which everybody does, but that's a practice I have learned from the Science magazine. And I played it back to my sources, and the sources, you would imagine the lawyers in Monsanto were up in arms, and within a week I had a lawsuit from one of the largest law firms in India on my table. They chased me down saying, you have trespassed into our fields and you've done this wrong and you're not allowed to be there. And my editors at that point deserted me. But I had evidence that they themselves had asked me to visit their fields. I had taken pictures of me in their fields along with their staff. I knew it's a story which could create trouble. So I had that evidence behind me that their own staff was there with me when I was in the field. So there was no question of trespassing. I think they were essentially trying to browbeat for people to fall in line. And they were not able to force us to fall in line. The same way the Roger Bilhem story on nuclear had a very different ending, the Monsanto story towards the end also had a very different ending than it should have been. While they sued me, but when the plant was released for use in the farmer's field, I was the first journalist to be taken in by Monsanto to see those trials. I told them, I said, you tried to break my back, you didn't succeed. So you will not get every time what you want, but I'm happy you realized that I didn't have an agenda. I was just chasing that there were certain things wrong in your protocol. And again, it showed to me the value of pursuing good science journalism based on facts.
Well, you're a great inspiration, and people would do well to follow your example.
I'm just one of you. I'm not different. I don't call myself an investigative journalist. I'm tenacious about whatever I do.
If I may, I'll just get as many comments in before we have to close. The gentleman there.
Yes, I'm Jarmo Salma from Finland. I write about innovations and technology. And what we are facing, the consumption of newspaper paper is going down. In Bay Area, they have fired 30% of journalists on that area. Guardian and BBC are facing big structural changes, and it seems that this kind of publishing environment that we have had since 60s is now changing a lot. The problem is that if we fighting against this indifference and ignorance, and the task is how to find the audience somehow in the blogosphere or anywhere when we have lost this kind of safe turf of it. And I think I would like to have some kind of ideas about the future. We lose the safeguarded wallet garden in the newspapers, but the need for the stories and the discussion is still existing. And that's the good point.
I'd like to follow that up, but I want to get as many comments as possible. So Chris.
Chris Russell, U.S. I guess I would really hope that going forward from this meeting, since this is focused on the World Federation, it's extremely exciting, and as I've been at, I think this is my third meeting, to see this growth in 45 plus associations around the world. I'd like to see the board and all of us as extensions be thinking about ways to communicate between the meetings and beyond the mentoring, which has been so extraordinarily successful. So I think taking where Palab started on a future focus, it's a completely different reality, and we just need to look at the creative side of that. And I'd really like to see the Federation, particularly on the website, and set up a mechanism where people can really exchange both individually and associations to talk about some of these new models. It's really hard to do it in this format. It, I think, gets everybody thinking. So I think the challenge would be to see how a lot of us are communicating individually from these meetings, and that's been exciting too. But I'd like to see the Federation be pushing the envelope in terms of gathering the international information. And I also liked the idea of extending, I know in the US, the health writers have recently joined the Federation in addition to the science writers. So broadening the base to health and environment reporters, where so many of these issues that people have been talking about are going on. So I'd really like to focus on the future and encourage the board to figure out ways to facilitate and make that happen, whether through the website or setting up something that can take all of these creative juices forward, because I do think, as Ruth and others said, it's just kind of time for the hand-wringing about the past, which we bemoan, but there are very exciting things going on around the world, and I'd like to hear about them.
Thank you, Chris. Well said. My advice to you is to browbeat someone who's going to be on the board. I'm stepping off. If there's anyone you know who's going to be a board member, Curtis, would you stand up? So Curtis is going to be on the next board of the World Federation. Hassle him, not me. The gentleman over there. Thank you, Curtis.
Thank you. I just want to share. I'm Irwan from...
Could you move the microphone very close to your lips?
I'm Irwan, a journalist from Kompas Daily, Jakarta, Indonesia. I just want to share the same story with Mr. Bagla, that I wrote several stories about the GMO, transgenic, and Monsanto, who tried to plant BT cotton, Bacillus thuringiensis cotton, in Indonesia. My chief editor asked me not to write anymore and confronted me with the Monsanto director in Indonesia. And Monsanto offered advertisement to my newspaper. That's the story that I tell you. I would raise a problem of predatory journals raised by Gina Colata in New York Times. I try to investigate the predatory journals that also the academicians from Indonesia publish in predatory journals. Most of them are published in India, your country, Mr. Bagla, and also in Egypt, Mr. Yahya. It's your country, but it's in the gray area. But I think we have to be very careful to interview academicians if they publish their research in predatory journals, which is, okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Aidan Gilligan from SciComm, and I'm here at Euroscience. I just want to make a comment and then a suggestion. The comment is based on, I was the press officer at the European Commission for 10 years for the three commissioners on research. And if the question today is, are science journalists doing their job? Well, just from my own experience, I would say probably not. Everything was really copy-paste, I would say. I would say the investigative journalist in science is very, very rare. And very obvious cover-ups would not be seen. And I often thought about this and I asked myself why, and kind of my conclusion was that the career of science journalism has been let die maybe by the science journalists themselves. We would constantly have journalists who were not scientists and they were only there because they spoke English. And I often ask myself, where's the recruitment out of the science journalist associations and out of the academia in Europe? I mean, there's no mobility, I perceive, in science jobs. So, I mean, I'm asking the newspapers and the TV stations here, do you recruit people who actually have a degree in science journalism? Or are you doing anything advocating that? Secondly, there's a lot of money out there to support your activities. I mean, the European Commission spends about $500 million on publishing brochures around scientific topics every year. And there's a huge amount of funding for presidency events and so on, but nobody is looking for that money. So the PR agencies are applying and getting it, pretending to be journalists. So I think you should think about that.
Yeah.
The amazing Professor Fleury is already one step ahead of you, Aidan, and he's gone to Horizon 2000 and trying to get some of that European money. Lady over there.
Well, yes, Cécile Klengler from France. I am the biology editor at the magazine La Recherche, which is a monthly magazine. But my question is about the new potential initiatives. We spoke a lot about the need of critical science journalism and the need of investigation. And investigation, as we said, takes time, and time is money, and we lack money. And I was wondering, is any of you, among you, ever tried to get money from crowdfunding through Kiss Bank or this sort of crowdfunding systems to get money, to have time to pursue an investigation? That's a question.
I think it is something that we've got to consider while we think the unthinkable. One of the problems with crowdfunding and blogging and the sort of self-publishing is it's still the big outlets.
I'm not speaking about self-publishing. I'm speaking about self-funding for investigation. And then you could submit your paper to a journal, to a magazine, because they all lack money. We know that. So there's no point trying to get money from newspaper. They don't have money anymore.
I think that's a great idea.
So it would be a little bit different. It wouldn't be self-publishing.
I can take a couple more brief comments before we close. Is there anyone else who's dying to... Gentleman over there. Let me come to you.
Thank you. My name is Fabio Turone from Italy. I just wanted to comment on the last issue, or the last question about the fact that the European Union of Science Journalists Association is trying to create a fund for a grant for investigative science journalism, looking for foundation money, and we are putting seed money for that, for beginning it. So this is a hope for the future, to have the chance of funding work that then will look for a publisher after it has been done for the expensive part.
Thank you, Fabio, and I think that's what we're going to try and do at the World Federation, try and get the best practice and initiative from, surely among our 45 associations, there's got to be minimum 45 great ideas. This will have to be the last question. Gentleman over there.
Neil Byrne, Science in Public. Just picking up from Jean-Marc talking about, obviously, the work the Federation has done in mentoring in developing countries. Perhaps at the conference we could see more mentoring, more case studies of the very best of science journalism. Both those people, like Veronique, who could talk about how she actually funded and made that happen. And also talking to some of the independent people, working out how people are making a living out of selling their journalism in this changing age. So it'd be nice to see at future conferences, perhaps in sessions where you recognise and deconstruct some of the best work.
Thank you very much, Neil. This session, I have to say, has exceeded my expectations. It has been a conversation among us. I hope we're able to carry this on. And it just leaves me to thank the panel. I'm sorry we didn't come to you, but the audience was so much better than you. So thank you to the audience. But I would like to thank you to the audience. And I'd like to ask the President of the World Federation of Science Journalists, Vesa, would you come and summarise your reflections on our conversation?
Thank you. Well, summarise this. Shortly, I would say that the theme of the conference, critical questioning in the public sphere, was invented when we went back to the history, to the Enlightenment period, which invented modern science, modern public sphere, reason took power of belief, and so on. So these still exist. This is the core of our profession. Let's not lose them. and let's bring them to this day. The next century, this happened in the 17th century. The next century invented paper mills. And when paper mills, modern paper mills began to produce paper, so they invented modern newspapers. Modern newspapers took the public sphere in the societies. And now modern newspapers, where they are, paper mills are going down in Western countries, in Finland especially. We have been rich of them. So paper mills are going down. Printed newspapers, are they disappearing, reformulating, but the profession still stands there. So what we should keep in mind that this critical questioning in our mind, but also that we found our ways to survive, not only to survive, but perhaps reinvent the ways we are doing our profession. Once again, yesterday I reminded that new technology, this computerized world has given us new possibilities. It's perhaps bigger invention than the paper mills and newspapers because it gives all those we had already and a lot of more public spheres. So how are we there? That's a good question. I have no answer, but I think the World Federation and the next conferences will work for that, and we are creating. I think who need answers, perhaps new models, new discussions, continuing discussions, but we cannot only discuss, we just need to earn our money to live to feed our families and ourselves. So at the same time we are doing what we can and inventing something new, keeping in mind the core of the profession. Let's not leave that. Let's make it better. And so I don't know, was this a conclusion or just a beginning of a new friendship? Perhaps let's wait for the next conference or the next conferences. There will be other conferences than this dealing with science journalism, regional conferences, national conferences. There should absolutely be. Let's continue these discussions. Let's gather them together. The World Federation is the center to gather them, but it's not the center to give you orders. You can order World Federation to do its job better. Okay, thank you. Yes, I have a duty to announcement. Well, I must read this. Helsinki City reception starts at 6 o'clock p.m., so after 30 minutes. And the organizers ask you kindly to go where is meant to hear. I think to the Senate Square. You can stand on the Senate Square because there are hundreds of people. It looks nice. Let's take photos of us on the public sphere, in the middle, in the heart of three institutions: university, church, and government. And we are in the middle of that public sphere. Okay, the announcement will continue. Okay, we will. Yes, yeah. Let's go there, and we will be guided. We will walk together to the venue of the City Hall. It's a blue Empire style building just in front of the Market Square. Oh yes, please remember to take that invitation card. I hope you have it. If don't, borrow your brothers and sisters' card when they have got in, and then they give it to you. Sorry, this is not an official announcement. Yes, and these orange T-shirts carried by these beautiful colleagues, you follow them. Yes, this is written here. And And departure for the orienteering will be from the City Hall after the city reception. There is an orienteering who have been for those who are going to this city orienteering, because you had to make your reservation in advance. So the buses for hey, one. This is very important. Hey, don't go anywhere. Science at midnight. Who has been so lucky that can take the bus to the Nuuksio National Park? Buses for the Science at Midnight session will leave from the Senate Square right outside the main doors at 10 p.m. Be awake. Don't sleep your happiness away. Okay, thank you.